Remember this guy? Jimmy Savile. Now passed away, Jimmy Savile was one of the country's most prolific paedophiles. His fall from grace scandalised the country and served as a warning to us all. Jimmy Savile got away with his crimes for one reason alone. He was powerful. He was powerful in our day because he was a celebrity. When you're a celebrity, people respect you, or might be scared of you. People didn't report their suspicions about Jimmy Savile because he was famous for being such a nice guy. Maybe they thought they wouldn't be believed. Jimmy Savile made friends with other important people like the police, making it less and less likely of him getting caught. Jimmy Savile's enormous power, built on a career of celebrity, became a protective shield that stopped him from meeting justice for several decades. The idea that there are individuals out there so powerful that they are almost beyond the law disgusts everybody. But it's not a new problem, it's a very old one, and in fact is the topic of our video today, the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. As with all our other poems, we'll be looking at the context of the poem, the story, the language, the structure, and the reason the poet wrote it. But before we begin, it's worth noting that not only did Robert Browning write My Last Duchess, he also had what I believe to be one of the ugliest beards I've ever seen. So what can we say about the context? Robert Browning, like some of the other poets we've looked at, was born around the 1800s and was watching the Industrial Revolution occur in the United Kingdom. He was seeing large numbers of individuals becoming extremely powerful. As well as this, you also had a large number of royal individuals, huge amounts of wealth. And then below the small number of individuals, you had everybody else, the vast majority of the population. It wasn't hard to see, and it certainly wasn't hard for Robert Browning, that these very rich and powerful people were so rich and so powerful that in many cases they could get away with what they wanted. Perhaps they could afford the best lawyers, perhaps they could bribe the judges, perhaps people were just too scared to take them on. Whatever it was, Robert Browning noticed that his world contained individuals who seemed almost untouchable. It's not difficult to see that this poem is still relevant today. If we quickly touch on the reason why the writer wrote it, essentially Robert Browning wanted to warn his audience about the unchecked power of a small number of people. And to do this, he told a story. So let's take a look at the story of the poem. For a fairly straightforward story about a man killing his wife, it's revealed in a rather complicated way. Our bad guy is this man. He is a duke. The duke is essentially a very important person, almost royalty if you like. The duke is having a meeting with this man. He's sort of like a messenger if you like, fairly important messenger, sent by another important duke, because this other important duke wants his daughter to marry our bad guy. Now let's be clear, nobody knows that our duke is a bad guy, only we do. And the only way we find out that he's a bad guy is by the cryptic things he says in the poem. Again, just to repeat, the messenger and the duke who sent the messenger have no idea that the duke over here, our guy, is a bad guy. They don't know that. This messenger is just there to organise a few details about the marriage. But at this meeting, the duke starts to show off a little bit. He starts pointing out all his posh little statues and then he starts talking about a particular painting. It's a painting of his previous wife. He describes what she was like with other people. And he gives across a clear impression that she was an incredibly nice lady, but nice to everybody equally. And he didn't like that. He wanted her to be extra nice to him. He even felt that because he'd married her, she could now use his name. And our bad guy Duke just didn't think that she showed enough appreciation for what she'd married into. The Duke then hints that he gave orders to have her killed. He never actually explicitly says, I killed her, but there's a clear implicit meaning behind his words that he did. Apparently, without realising how much he's revealed, the Duke returns to showing off. pointing out more of his wonderful little trinkets, including a statue of Neptune. And that's where the poem ends. We don't get any response from the messenger. We don't hear from anybody else. It's all just the Duke talking. And if we weren't paying attention, we might not have noticed all these little details. And once we've gone over these details, we soon realise that the Duke is a person of extraordinary power and has abused that power. In this case, he was an abusive partner that ultimately killed the person he was supposed to love. On another level, the Duke represents all those powerful individuals out there who seem to get away with whatever they want without ever getting caught. So how do we know the Duke's a bad guy? How do we know that he might have killed his wife? How do we know that Robert Browning has got this wider message, this bigger message about the abuse of power? Well, we know these things because of the language and the structure that the poet has used. So let's take a look at the language first. The first line of the poem is fantastic to talk about. There's lots of words in there that are extremely suggestive of the abuse of power. It begins with the Duke pointing to the painting, and he says first of all that is my last Duchess. My is a possessive pronoun, and as the name suggests, it suggests possessing something, as if the Duke owned the woman. The very next word, last, is an adjective, and this suggests that it's a collection. That's my last one. I intend to have more. And then Duchess, that's a noun. Nouns are for things or objects. When you're talking about people, when you use names, names are nouns, but they're called proper nouns. He doesn't use her name. He calls her his Duchess. Again, treating her like some sort of object. An object of a collection? Probably. Treating people like objects or parts of collections or things that you can own is all an abuse of power, and this abuse is presented in a very negative way, and therefore we know that the poet does not like this abuse of power at all. The very next line, looking as if she were alive, is also full of language devices. Let's tidy things up a bit. First of all, it's a simile, looking like she was alive, but she isn't. It doesn't suggest much other than giving us the image that the painting is very realistic. But in this line, we discover that the last Duchess is dead, and slightly foreshadowing what we're about to find out. Also, overall, just this first introduction to his previous wife comes across as extremely unemotional, very cold. If I was talking about a previous wife who had died, I'd perhaps say, oh, that's my beloved Sandra, or that's my wife, sadly she died, and so on. I wouldn't have introduced my deceased wife in this very unemotional way. It does suggest that the Duke has little or no emotion for his last Duchess. And again, it suggests that this Duke is in some way evil or to be disliked. And then if you're not convinced that he has no emotion about her death, he then spends more time talking about the artist who painted the painting rather than his wife. He's more interested in the object that he has rather than the real human being he lost. In fact, he even says that he calls the painting a piece of wonder. Not his wife, but the painting's a piece of wonder. Again, emphasizing how he seems to be creating a collection of some sort. So you might be thinking that the Duke doesn't have very many emotions. That might not make you dislike him completely. But then he starts showing off. He says, "For never read strangers like you that pictured countenance." That means other people never really see this painting properly, the depth and passion of its earnest glance. But to myself they turned. People had to turn to the Duke to find out what the painting was really about and why the painting was so good. This tells us that the Duke thinks he's better than everybody else and knows better than everybody else. You have to ask him about what the painting's about. And then another weird thing is suggested. He keeps the painting behind a curtain, and no one is allowed to move the curtain but him, and he's drawn it aside to show the person he's talking to. It really does make you wonder why, if you have a beautiful painting of your wife who's died and you should be upset about this, why do you keep it hidden behind a set of curtains so that no one can ever see it? That does seem strange. And again, it suggests that he didn't like his wife and suggests a motivation for killing her. And also, why did he decide to show the painting to the representative of the new woman he wants to marry? If he murdered his last wife, he doesn't want to start pointing to his last wife. He doesn't want to start talking about her as if he killed her either. It sort of suggests that the Duke thinks he is untouchable, that there's nothing that anybody can do to punish him for what he's done. Or perhaps he doesn't even think he's done anything wrong. When he's got that much power and you can do what you want, then whatever you do is right. Then the Duke starts talking about the sort of questions people ask him about the painting. And people often ask about the way the woman is looking in the picture. Something about her eyes, maybe something about her smile. The Duke says people always ask him about this particular look. And the Duke seems a little bit annoyed to say that it was not because he was in the room that made that particular joy on the Duchess's cheek appear in the painting. In other words, in the painting, the Duchess looks extremely happy, and the Duke seems a bit annoyed that it's not because he's in the room. He starts suggesting that maybe it's the artist was getting that particular look from his wife. Maybe he's jealous of the artist. He even starts suggesting that the artist might have been talking to himself, saying to himself how difficult it might be to paint the half flush along her throat. Flush here is blushing. When we get nervous, we might blush a little bit. She seems to be blushing along her throat. Now, painting blushing is probably really difficult, so the Duke is thinking that the artist might have been saying to himself, gosh, this is going to be too difficult to do. But it's the way that the Duke says it, using the word dies along her throat as well. It says throat, not neck. I would have said neck if I was talking about somebody blushing. It seems to foreshadow the possible murder we seem to work out from what the Duke is saying. Let's tidy things up again. The Duke now starts talking about his wife, and he doesn't exactly start talking about her in a positive way. The first thing that he brings up seems to be something that annoys him. What annoys him is that she had a heart, how should he say, too soon made glad. In other words, a heart that really quickly became very happy, no problem. This metaphor to describe his wife just means that she always seemed to be happy and everything seemed to make her happy. But he didn't see that as a good thing. He said she was too easily impressed, maybe suggesting he thought she was a bit like a child, or maybe she was a bit stupid. She liked whatever she looked on, he says. And then, reminding himself about what she looked on, he then says that her looks went everywhere. This suggests that he thought she was looking at other men. Certainly we can conclude that the Duke was jealous. The Duke then takes the time to list off a bunch of things that she really liked, and then he seems most annoyed that she might think his gift of marriage, in other words, being able to use his very old famous name, as the same as any other gift she might get. He thought that she seemed just as happy to get a bunch of flowers from somebody as marrying him. The Duke certainly thought he was better than just a bunch of flowers, that his name was worth much more than any other gift, but to his last Duchess, she seemed to treat them all equally. This annoyed him. The Duke then reminds us about how amazing he is as a person. He says, who would stoop to point out these problems? Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? And this means who would take the time to point out these mistakes? But he uses the word stoop. And stoop means to bend down and to get down to someone's level. In short, the Duke is saying that he's some sort of higher person, much better than everybody else, and he would have to come down to his Duchess's stupid level to explain to her why she's such an idiot for treating everything the same. And to compound our dislike of the Duke, not only does he rate himself really, really highly, he then says that he would never stoop to somebody's lower level. He would never bring himself down to even help his wife. Stoop here, of course, being a verb, something you do. Then he complains again about how she used to smile when she passed him, but would also smile whoever would pass by. She'd just smile at everybody, and he thought it was the same smile, no matter who they were. This annoyed him, again suggesting he was jealous. It was his jealousy that leads to his abuse of power, as well as his belief that he can get away with it, as well as his belief he is the best. And then we get the possibly the most important line: I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. What does this mean? I think everybody's allowed their own interpretation of it, but here's mine. Commands means orders. I believe he gave orders to somebody to go out and kill her. And the way he says it, I gave commands, suggests that he feels he's allowed to do this, that he's entitled in some way to give such orders to have his wife killed. And certainly from the way he was talking about her earlier, he didn't really love her, he didn't care for her. So I'd imagine him describing it as just giving commands as if to some sort of dog. Maybe this suggests not only he didn't love her, but he saw her as nothing more important than just an object or even a pet, something you own. And at this climactic last line, we then suddenly jump to the finishing of a conversation. It finishes very much as any other sort of conversation would finish. He says, well, shall we get up? Wilt please you rise? We'll go and meet everybody else. You can tell me about this marriage I've got coming up to this other Duke's lovely daughter. And as we go out, don't forget, I'd really like you to take a moment to see my wonderful statue that I keep. Again, aren't I amazing? So, including lots of conversational language. Wilt thou please rise? Again, this conversational language suggests how unconcerned the Duke is with getting caught for what he's done, or suggesting that he just doesn't believe that what he's done is wrong. Let's talk about structure. You ever had one of those friends that doesn't stop talking? You can't get a word in edgeways. And not only that, they just talk about how amazing they are all the time. They're not particularly nice people, pretty annoying. They always think they're right. Take a look at the poem. It's just one long big block of one man talking about himself. There are no stanzas. This is because the Duke seems to like talking about himself. The effect of this is to make the reader dislike him. It also suggests how those like the Duke who have enormous power will only care about themselves. The powerful become selfish. Another point is the punctuation seems to be used all over the place. There's no pattern there. So with no stanzas and no pattern, is this a kind of chaotic poem, in the same way that a poet would reject structure and pattern if they were trying to do a poem about war and chaos? Is this a chaotic poem? Well, it shouldn't really be a chaotic poem, because the Duke as a person seems to be very unchaotic. The Duke seems to be a very thoughtful, organised sort of person, a man that plans ahead. So shouldn't really the poet have some sort of pattern in there? And the poem does. it's all done in rhyming couplets. Wall, call, hand, stand, said, read, etc. And again, this, you might say, slightly hidden pattern suggests the planning skills the Duke has, particularly good if you want to plan a murder. And finally, of course, you want to talk about what sort of voice it's in. It's in the first person, and obviously first person, as with anything, usually gives you this personal view of a particular topic. It makes it more believable, more honest, so we don't think the Duke is lying with anything that he's saying. But also it's in the first person because the Duke loves himself. He's this very selfish person. Of course, this would be a poem in the first person. So what have we covered? Let's take a look. We've covered the context of the poem. We've covered the story, language and structure. So why did the writer write it? Well, when we're talking about these particular poems and for our exam, the intention has to be something about power, and he wants to talk about the abuse of power. How the rich, the wealthy, the powerful can commit crimes and seem to get away with it. A problem of his day, in his context, and a problem for today as well. This abuse of power comes out through the language and the structure. So this also leads to what we might want to compare it to. Again, any other poem that might have something to do with abuse of power. You've got Ozymandias, you've got London, you've even got Charge of the Light Brigade as well. Ozymandias was about the abuse of power by a leader. London is the abuse of power again by leaders, as we can see in the city. Charge of the Light Brigade is the abuse of military power, making mistakes, causing people to die. You could even say, checking out my history, because of the power of white people over black people for so long. This abuse of power means that black people often find it difficult to find out about famous black individuals throughout history. Okay, well, that was a pretty long one. It is a long poem, but it's chock full of easy language devices to talk about. It's quite memorable as well. It's no great surprise to find poems about war in school anthologies, but a good poem about a psychopathic murderer is a refreshing change. Good luck with the revision, guys.